I'm recording now. Sorry.
Recording now. Okay, great. Thank you. I hope you don't mind being recorded. So I was lucky enough to be in Alexandria 4 years ago, working with the great teaching team there. So it's a pleasure to be invited back and to be talking to you this morning. Here in Norwich, which is where Niall is based and where I've been for coming up to 12 years now. And afternoon for those of you who are in Egypt, and for others who are joining us. I think I see some indications of people from outside Egypt as well, so you're very welcome, whichever time zone you're on. So I'd like to try and tackle a few different things today, all connected with this theme of teaching and assessing integrated skills and the role of mediation, in particular the mediation descriptors from the companion volume from the CEFR in the session. So I'm going to start off with some thoughts about assessment generally. Assessment literacy and teacher assessment literacy, and understanding the impact and the implications of assessment decisions, a large part of my professional work at Niall. And then we're going to think a little bit about integrating the skills, and then the implications of that for teaching and the teacher's role in working with integrated skills with the students, and then some of the implications for assessment as related to the integration of skills, some examples from test publishers, and some implications for designing integrated assessment yourself, and then to move on to the concept of mediation, the way it's framed and presented in the Common European Framework of Reference, and particularly the work that's gone into the mediation scales and the underpinning principles in the new companion volumes from 2018 and the 2020 revision, and what that mediation means in terms of integration, which I hope I'll be able to convince you is something both very much real world and authentic and action oriented, but also well underpinned by the scales that we have available in the Common European Framework. So that's the ambition. In true form, I'm going to use a presentation to help me move through this, and I hope that this will work in all aspects in terms of navigation and some of the content I want to show you. It does mean with this presentation mode that I'm not going to be looking at the chat box through the session, so please either drop questions in as we go that the team at the Teacher Training Centre in Forest University will pick out, or come back to me at the end when we have a Q&A session. So if that's all okay with everybody, I would like to begin with a quiz, a test, an exam. Let's call this one a short test. And it's a very simple test. It's a multiple choice test. I'm pretty convinced that language learners and learners generally, and certainly teachers in every context, are familiar with multiple choice questions and how to respond to them. So it's a 4-option multiple choice question, with the question being, which tree is the biggest? Now here is an opportunity for you to use that chat box to tell me your answer. Which tree is the biggest? Okay, I can see some answers coming through. Okay, very confidently dividing you between A's and D's here. Okay, and a couple of rejections of the question based on the way the question was framed. And absolutely, yes, it's a bit of an unfair start to a session with a trick question. But really, one answer is you're all right, whether you choose A, B, C, or D. And an even better response to that is that it depends, because of course there's a problem with framing a question like the biggest without defining what big really means for us. And if you'll allow me this analogy with language learning, perhaps my conception of big is the idea of discrete items of language knowledge. So perhaps in that case, if we were to make an analogy with the leaves on a tree, we could say that A is the biggest and A has the most items within it that we could count if we were counting leaves. It may be that for us in terms of biggest, we actually mean highest on an external scale, an external proficiency scale, and whatever descriptors of performance that scale gives, then B might be the highest on that measurement, the biggest amount of description covered for a particular learner. It might be that actually big for us means a breadth of knowledge and an ability to use the language we have in different domains, in different contexts of use. And so we might be talking about breadth, or in the tree analogy, the girth, the circumference of the trunk there. So it might be that C is the answer if we're defining big in that sense. Or it might be, if you'll allow me to continue the analogy, that actually we're talking about the underlying competencies, the depth of language knowledge, how far the roots go that enable us to action the language and knowledge we have to use language productively. So it's the underlying knowledge store repository of language we have, in which case D might be the correct answer. So we can see that defining the way we want to measure anything, and particularly an analogy with language learning, really depends on us having a clear definition of what we mean by the terms we're using, whether that's big or whether that's proficiency or whether that's language knowledge or whether that's language use. If we knew that definition of big, then it would be quite simple to perform a calculation, to perform a measurement on the tree. But of course, language learning's not as easy as counting leaves on a tree or measuring the roots or measuring the height. Actually, because language learning is fluid and dynamic, it's a little bit more like saying, well, how do we measure the size of a swarm of bees? And yes, of course, we could put that into a hive situation, perhaps a testing box, and then we have an ability to count. But if we're trying to see this in action, in movement in the real world, where on earth do we slice this? Do we measure this to determine the size or the action of a swarm of bees? So perhaps our analogy of the trees is even leading us down a difficult path. And actually, we need to think of language learning and the way we measure that learning and that use of language in a more dynamic way that's reflective of how it's used in real life situations, how it's used for real life tasks, how it's used in the target language use environments which our learners are being helped to operate within. This also leads us to another challenge that we have to reflect, and I hope you'll see the value of these quotes as we move on and think about mediation, and particularly defining integration when we talk about measurement. You'll have seen or heard versions of the first quote there, I'm sure, this idea that not everything that can be counted is of value, counts for the purpose we want to do it. So just because we can give 100-item multiple choice test doesn't mean that the answers on all those 100 items are particularly useful for every purpose we want to measure it in language. And also particularly important for integrated skills, not everything that counts in the integration of skills is possible to count, to measure in traditional ways. So we might have to think of different ways of measuring, different approaches to measurement that reflect integrated skills, to make sure that things that really count can be measured in some way, can be made tangible, or can be made visible in terms of the learners, the teachers, and the other stakeholders who need to understand the results of our approaches to assessment. And the second quote really underlines this need to define, need to describe what are really complex phenomena. The processes of learning in a first language are difficult enough, but learning language as an additional language, as a second language, as a third language, as a lingua franca, as a language for international communication, still very complex phenomena within the brain, within neurolinguistics, to decide what's happening in the interaction between our second language resources and our first language skills. And we have to do this in a small number of words. We have to do this in rating criteria. We have to do this in feedback to students. We have to do this in sharing results with the test users. So we're restricted to a small number of words very often, and our theories are still developing, particularly our theories of how languages are learned, how languages are used, and how measurement theory applies to assessment. So we've got some challenges. We've got some challenges in the theoretical basis. We've got some challenge in the definition of construct, definition of our beliefs about what language is and how language is used. But we've also got some other challenges in the integration of what we believe as good learning and teaching principles into what we believe are good testing and assessment principles. And I'm certainly one of these people who believes that assessment is an integrated, crucial part of teaching and learning. And I'd even go so far as to say that all teachers assess all the time. I'm not saying all teachers test all the time, but all teachers assess all the time, because we're always making decisions based on our perception of what's happening in our students' production, comprehension, attitude, behavior, motivation, all of these decisions that we make about whether to review language, whether to move on to the next task, whether to provide extra input, whether to allow chance for language to sink in, whether to give wait time before students respond to a question. All of these are decisions which are assessment based, and that may be very informal through to the most formal, but teachers are constantly assessing in some form. So let's have a look at this in practice. I'm going to show you a short video. And it's a video of my son, and he's involved in a teaching and learning sequence, learning his first language. And I want you to watch this very short video. Hopefully the sound will work and you'll be able to hear his teacher for this activity. And I want you to think about 3 questions. And the 3 questions are very simple. The first question is, what's the target language? What's he trying to learn? And what's his teacher hoping that he will learn in this learning sequence? The second question, what principles of good pedagogy, good teaching and learning practice can you see in the learning sequence, and what his teacher does with him? And thirdly, when does teaching turn to testing? At what moment does the teaching stop and the testing begin? So 3 questions. What's the target language? What's he trying to learn? What principles of good teaching and learning can you see? And when does teaching turn to testing? Here we go.
A yellow one. Get a green one, Lukey. A green one. Can you find a green one? Look, here. Here's a green one. Oh, that's a yellow one. Can you get a green one now? Yeah, good boy. Another green one. That's good. And a yellow one. Now a yellow one.
The yellow one?
No, that's a green one. A yellow one. The other colour. There's the other colour. There, yellow one. Good. What colour's that, Lukey?
Okay, so there we are. This is Luke involved in his learning sequence. Okay, so I'm putting the chat box back here so I can just see a few answers from you. You can answer question 1, 2, or 3, but as Nashwa has done, put the number of the question in there so I can track it. Yes, in a physical sense, she was trying to teach him to put things on the pole, but in a linguistic sense, trying to teach him colours. Can we be more specific? Shaima's there, yeah, focusing in really on those 2 items, yellow and green, perhaps a bit more focused than all colours generally. So good. Renal's coming to question 3. What about some good teaching and learning principles that you saw in there? What did you like about that teaching sequence? Probably takes a little bit more time to type things there. Okay, so verbal incentives, thanks Renal. So yeah, lots of teacher input there, lots of support, learning by doing, absolutely, giving him encouragement and giving him A little bit of repetition opportunities. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, checking, giving an example. Yeah, giving him time. It was learner centered. It was student paced. Lots of opportunity for doing things at his own speed. Any fear of failure there? Was he nervous about getting it wrong? No, so he's got freedom to make mistakes, freedom to do things at his own pace. It's game based. It's task driven. He's using motor skills. There's kind of kinesthetic learning in there. So we've got lots of nice teaching and learning principles. And then when we get to one point in that short sequence, we had a moment in which perhaps we could say teaching turned to testing. And I already saw one of the responses here. What was the moment that his teacher decided, okay, enough teaching and learning, you've got to the top of the stack, here's the test. Can anyone remember what the test question was? Okay, great. Thank you, Mai. So yeah, what colors that one? So he's got to the top of the stack, and then we went, okay, what colors that one? And this is the moment where, okay, you've done the task, you've got to the end in terms of your task outcome. Now have you processed the input? Is it ready to become output? Can you answer this question on color? So let's see. Let's bear in mind, I'm going to minimize the chat. Thank you for all your responses there. Let's bear in mind that this is my son. He was only 1.5, I think, going on 2. So how many of you are confident that all of those good teaching and learning principles have supported the acquisition of this fairly limited target language, yellow and green? Is he going to get this answer correct? Let's hope so. Okay, over to you, Luke. Can you tell us the answer to your test question, please? Oh, excuse me.
What colour's that, Lukey?
Red.
Oh dear. Oh dear. This is why teachers don't like testing, isn't it? All of that great pedagogical input, all of those principles that we hold dear, and we get to the test question and he comes up with the answer red. Where did that go? We didn't even mention red. All we talked about was yellow and green. So what's gone on here? Why has teaching and testing gone so mismatched here in this short learning sequence? Well, perhaps there's different things going on here. Perhaps it's just a process of natural learning and natural acquisition, that actually we need time between input and acquisition and output. And so he's not ready to produce the new language. He's not ready cognitively or linguistically to realize that those words have now become part of his repertoire and to be able to use them actively. Perhaps it's just a time question. Perhaps it's something a little bit deeper in that. Perhaps it's that actually some of those teaching and learning principles weren't appropriate, weren't what was needed at that moment. Maybe it's something about lexical priming, as is mentioned earlier there, that actually his association of the word color, his first kind of synaptic response is red, because we talk about a lot of red things when we're introducing students or children to the outside world. We say, look at that red ball, look at that red bus, look at that red phone box. I know that's very traditional British reds, but you know what I mean. We focus in on those bright primary colors. Maybe actually his task focus is somewhere completely different and he's not ready to be tested there. Maybe he's confused by why on earth is this person asking me a test question at the moment. Actually though, the reason I'm pulling this into this presentation today is because I think it's something different. I think that actually what's happening here is that our teaching and our assessment, or our teaching and testing, is not aligned in an appropriate way. What's happened here is that our teaching and learning focus has been on yellow and green. Yellow, 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 green, green, green. Is that yellow? Is that green? Pick a green one. That's a yellow one. And actually, when he comes to the test question, we've asked him not, is that a yellow one or is that a green one? But we've turned it around. We've said, what color is that? So actually, we're not asking about yellow and green at all. We're asking, do you know that yellow and green are part of a set of words, a set of adjectives that we use to describe appearance, but that have a superordinating term called color, which is the way we use to refer to that whole set. When we frame the question that way, we can see, goodness me, that's a challenge for anyone cognitively to be asked a test question that doesn't actually relate directly to the teaching and learning content. So I think perhaps it's worth bearing this in mind, and we're thinking actually, to what extent does the assessment approach, the testing approach in this setting, if you'll accept that's a test question, or the assessment approach generally, to what extent does that truly align with the way we deal with language and language knowledge and language skills in the way we teach, test and assess? And so that's a theme I want to run with. Now, absolutely, a different question, a differently framed question may have produced a different result. And as someone said, Linda said, maybe he just wanted to show off the other colors, you know, and actually he knew very well, he just wasn't prepared to perform for his mother teacher. But of course, we do have to recognize the individual learner and their fear. So having known that I was going to show this, he wanted to prove to you all.
This is yellow. This is green. And this is red.
So he wanted to prove to you all that he does know it. And they do get there eventually. They do get there with support, but that's not necessarily useful for us when we're teaching to a syllabus, to a timetable, when we've got end of semester tests, end of year tests. We have to make those testing schedules appropriate for the learning pace. So even though they might get there eventually, does that help us with teaching, learning and moving into assessment? Well, we're not just talking about assessment generally. I want to focus in on integration and integrated skills. So let's start with a definition of what we mean by integrated and integrated skills. So a general dictionary definition of the word integrated is that idea of combining things of different types in one effective unit, group or system. I just wanted to pick up on that word effective there, because really it's about the effectiveness of the grouping that we need to be relevant to our integrated approach in language teaching. Taking an approach from the literature, a little bit of a wordy definition here, but looking at language education and integration, we recognize that linguistic performance involves the capability of mobilizing linguistic competence and performances in an integrated way. Understanding, speaking, reading, or writing of connected discourse. So in the literature, we're really thinking that ordinary situations call on us to use more than one skill at one time. We're almost always using our skills in an integrated way in a real world context. Even if that real world context is an educational context, it's very rare that we will have a single skill being operationalized at only one time. You're listening to me, you're reading from the screen, I'm reading and I'm speaking. You'll possibly be reading, listening, and leading on to speaking if you're watching this with colleagues and talking about it, or maybe you've been tasked with writing a summary of this presentation that you're going to need to. Sometimes I'm asking you to write in the chat box. Even in these kind of controlled situations where essentially I have a mono channel of speaking and you are listening, we're still not using skills completely independently. So integrated is real and real world. One of the major features of language teaching, however, is that we've separated out the skills into what is referred to here as pedagogically convenient units, groups, systems. So we've said, okay, it's easier to do a listening lesson and to have that as a pedagogical approach. That's what we see in our initial teacher training courses. That's what we see, okay, how to teach listening, how to teach reading. We see this in course books, that there's a separate area of the syllabus focused on listening or separate focused on reading. We see this in the way we design our curriculum. Here's the listening lesson. Here's the perhaps reading and writing collected together, but we know that even in reading and writing classes, we're going to be listening and speaking as part of that. So this pedagogical convenience perhaps sells us a falsehood for the way in which actually language works in the real world and language works in the educational setting. Another problem for assessment is the fact that even when we have integrated teaching, even when we acknowledge the integration of skills in a classroom setting or in another learning setting, the fact that we're asking learners to read or listen for a purpose, and that purpose is often productive rather than just checking boxes. In the testing world, so much of our leadership from the large scale test providers has been this separation into discrete point-based. Here's a listening test with listening questions. Here's a reading test with reading questions. Here's a writing test with as minimal input as possible so as not to contaminate your writing skill. Here's a speaking test, which is hard to isolate completely, but let's keep the input minimal, so we're only testing your speaking. And here's the rating criteria, which only talks about the macro skills within the broader concept of one of the skills, and the micro skills involved in actually operationalizing that. So we've got this challenge, all these clashes running through the world of teaching and testing that we have to face if we want to embrace integrated teaching and integrated assessment. So what is the opposite of integrated? How have we seen things, and what terms can we use? Is it that the opposite of integrated is segregated? That is a very loaded term to keep those skills separate. When we talk about it as segregated, we probably wouldn't even dream of saying, oh, we're only going to segregate listening into its own thing. Is it that we think of those skills as independent and they need to be taught independently or measured independently? Are we saying that we can isolate them? We can really remove them from contamination by the others? Is it that these are discrete components of language that we can measure with discrete point testing, and we can have discrete items that only focus on one aspect of one skill? Or is the reality that when we don't do things in an integrated fashion, everything becomes disintegrated? Possibly. For my purposes, I'm going to be contrasting things in terms of either integrated approaches to skills or treating skills as independent concepts. So with this established, and I hope you're with me in the arguments I'm making in favor of integrated approaches and the challenges we have in the traditional paradigms, the traditional approaches to teaching and assessment, we need to think about the implications here for what it means, firstly on the teaching side, and secondly on the testing and assessment side. So I'm going to start with teaching, and I want to ask you to be careful, to beware of the spork. Is this a new vocabulary item for you? Has anybody heard of the spork? 30 seconds for anybody in the chat box who knows what a spork is. Very good, Linda, straight in there. Okay, so an eating utensil, yes, it is indeed, Renal. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so for many of you, you'll be introduced to a new word today, and possibly one of the least useful words you've ever been exposed to in a language seminar. It's an integration of a spoon and a fork. Never really caught on, has it? The idea that actually we don't need two of these utensils. We've only got two hands, so let's go for a knife in one and a spork in the other. That will cover all bases, except that we can see the problems here. There are some approaches to eating where actually integrating things so completely is counterproductive. What if we're spaghetti lovers, for example, and actually we need to have two independent utensils to make our eating approach, and so we need to think about when we're integrating, are we doing this for a good reason? Are we integrating the skills together for a genuinely valuable purpose, or actually are we better to treat them as independent because perhaps we need to do remedial work in one area? We really need to focus on the way that underlying competences fit into one area. We need to look at the micro skills. We need to look at mechanics of one skill. So perhaps actually independence is a valuable approach for teaching. I want to sound another alarm, because what I think a danger is when we take an integrated approach to teaching is that we forget things. And to emphasize this, or to illustrate this, I'm just going to take you through a short integrated learning sequence. So I want to talk about the other side of integrated skills teaching, and I'm going to show you a few pictures to get us started. Just have a look at these pictures as they appear on your screen, and you can let me know in the chat box if you can find a common thread between these pictures. Any ideas? I'll go back through them. Any ideas what a common thread might be between these pictures on the screen? Birds, pigeons, birds. Yeah, we're going to need to get you to be more specific than that. What's this guy holding a pigeon for? I've deliberately blurred the caption. It's not just about feeding, it's not just about birds. Actually, all these pictures are related to the idea of homing pigeons, birds which return to their home wherever they're dropped, and particularly the ones who do that fastest, racing pigeons, and the concept of racing pigeons being able to race each other when they're released from one destination to be the fastest to return home. You may think, I don't think this is particularly common in Egypt. It's traditionally associated with the north of England, but it's actually a worldwide sport, and you'll be terrified, perhaps terrifically excited to learn that recently a racing pigeon was sold for breeding in China as the champion racing pigeon for €1 million. So it's not an inconsequential sport for the people who are involved in it. But the idea is that these birds return to their home base and do it in as fast a time as possible. And this is all to activate your schemata, to get you thinking about a topic, perhaps a topic that's new to you, because we're going to do a short reading activity. And we're going to do it very short because you're not my language students. You're here to think about integrated approaches to testing, but and to teaching. So our first activity in this little learning sequence has been to familiarize you with the concept and to give you a picture lead in. Now I'm going to invite you to do a short reading activity. You have two tasks in the reading activity. You have to choose the best headline from the newspaper story. There are 3 headlines to choose. And then you have to do a little bit more detailed reading for specific information, a little bit of further comprehension of the story with some reading questions. Where was the pigeon supposed to fly to? Where was she found? Did she fly all the way home? And how was her physical health after the adventure? So you've got your reading questions. Here's your reading text. I'm going to give you just 60 seconds to read through and make your own summation of which headline would be most appropriate, and then to see if you can answer any of those questions. I'm aware that I haven't put the questions in a format where you can refer to them. It's just to demonstrate a traditional learning sequence focused on a reading text. Okay. Okay, lots of you answering in the chat box. No need for that here. I'm going to go through this in a much faster way because I'm just demonstrating a principle here. So let's head back. Here were the headline questions. Which one did you go for? Which one did you go for? A headline appropriate for that text you read. Okay, Samar is going for number 2, as is everybody else. So yeah, Long Way to Fly Rio is in with the genre of the text, this kind of light-hearted newspaper article, probably from a tabloid newspaper. First one a little bit too formal, and the third one presenting incorrect information about the article. So we've got the right question. Can we do the others from memory? Where was the pigeon supposed to fly to? Back home was the answer there. Kent, Herne Bay in Kent. Great. Where was she found? Did we get any answers for that? Where was she found? Salvador in Brazil. Great, Paolo. Thank you. Did she fly all the way home? Did she have to make that journey? No, didn't make it home. Was helped with her journey home. How was her physical health after the adventure? Did she suffer? Lovely, lovely condition. Okay, so we're getting all the answers. Now, the reason we do this is we want to get the general conceptualization of our reading comprehension. That's the purpose of our kind of reading for gist question in that headline match. And then we've got some specific information to orient us through the text, to check we've picked out the key facts about the text. Because what I'm going to ask you to do now, or I would ask my students to do, and I'm explicitly not going to ask you to do now, is to be in pairs to recreate this text verbally. So you've seen the text, you've done your reading comprehension. I'm now going to remove the text from you, and in pairs, we could do this in a breakout room, but we really haven't got time. I'd ask you to recreate this text verbally, to check that if you and your partner can put the story back together using just your answers from the reading comprehension to orient you. Can you rebuild that text verbally to check understanding, to check the order of events, to check the outcome? Can you do that in pairs? And then I'm going to ask you, if you're students in my class, to join with another pair. So we've now got 4 students in a group, and to reconstruct that text in written form. So can you reconstruct the story together? Can you use what you've done from the reading and what you've put together with your speaking skills and listening to each other's answers to structure the text? Can you now recreate that story in written form? How close can you get to the original? And then we can compare with the original, and your group can identify what was close to the original and what was different from the original. We've got this collaborative writing activity. We've gone from reading through listening and speaking to writing. So it's an integrated skills lesson. Is that a good example of integrated skills in teaching? We've certainly got 4 skills in action at different parts, reading and listening throughout. And in a way, it's a very good example of an integrated skills lesson. We've got the 4 skills integrated around a particular topic. But for me, and this is the danger, and the danger I want to highlight, there's a real problem there. Because I'm a teacher, you're teachers. Our job is to teach. I didn't do any teaching there. All I did was give opportunities for practice. I gave you an opportunity to practice your reading skills. I gave you an opportunity to listen to each other and to speak about something that you'd read about. I gave you an opportunity to write in a collaborative format. I don't think I've taught you anything. I'm just a facilitator here. I've just set up activities. I've found a text. I've written some questions. I've got you in a classroom. I've put you in pairs. I've given you the task. I've checked the task. I've given you an opportunity to write together, and I've asked you to check together. Where's my teaching? That's very unsatisfying. I can walk away from that lesson rubbing my hands thinking, integrated skills, wasn't that fun? They all enjoyed it. They now know about racing pigeons and a particular story, and they've all had a chance to integrate the skills. Aren't I a great teacher? But there's no teaching involved there. We're not just facilitating. I want to do more in my teaching. Maybe I can, as Dave's saying, observe, monitor, assess, give feedback, but there's more to integrated skills than just setting up opportunities for practicing those skills. And so where I think we have to focus when we're working in integrated skills in the teaching sense is where we can intervene, where the teacher can interject, can support, can draw attention, can draw noticing to actually activities which will make the learners better at using their integrated skills, which will make them more effective as readers into writers, which will make them more effective as readers into speakers, which will make them more effective as listeners into writers, which will make them more effective listeners into speakers. And I think very often and very tangible for a teacher, this means drawing attention to and having explicit stages in the lesson for noticing of language and encouraging reuse of that language. And it's really important when we talk about mediation, because so much of our language use is about working with other people's texts. And what I've done in this setup is asking learners to mediate another text, the text they haven't written, they haven't come up with, they haven't invented the text about the racing pigeon. Their task is to mediate this text for others, to mediate this text in their small groups. So how can we help them get better in a teaching sense? Well, a key part of this is to draw their attention to reusable and useful language. Very often in a reading lesson or a listening lesson, we think, let's pre-teach the vocabulary, let's pre-teach the useful vocabulary. Well, do they know what a pigeon is? Do they know what a dock is? Do they know what a tag is? Do we know what climate is? And we pre-teach those words which may seem unfamiliar from a text like this, but actually they're fairly redundant once we get outside this text and into the real world of language use. What's actually much more useful is if we focus on the words which are wholly reusable, and can we find examples of language in that text which will actually be useful for them into their integrating into speaking and integrating into writing. Because I don't really care if they can use the word dock and tag correctly. What I care about is whether they can take these lexical chunks, these phrases, these reusable pieces of language, which are all part of language and all part of the reading and listening that learners do with text. Can they take them and can they make them part of their repertoire? Because this is teaching now in integrated skills rather than just opportunities for practice. So in our text, in our pigeon text, we've got great examples of language. And I promise you, when I've done this with students, unless we draw attention to this, they skip these, they miss these. They're just trying to get the detail out of the text, the concrete details, and they miss all this really reusable language. And if we look at that text, we'll see it's full of this useful language to stray off course, to end up somewhere, to take an amount of time to get somewhere, to give up hope of doing something, to get a call from someone, to give someone permission to do something, to give someone a lift, to find your way somewhere, for something to do you good. All of this language is in that text, but it's kind of invisible unless we draw attention to it, because they're focusing on Herne Bay, Kent, sailor, Rio, tag, ship, Europe, channel. They're missing all of the really valuable information which will help them be better at using their integrated skills, that will help them take things from their reading and listening and put it into practice in their speaking and writing. So my argument for integrated skills use in teaching is that we have a real responsibility to draw attention to the kind of language which is going to make them better in the productive side of their integrated skills, and not just be content with setting up opportunities for practice without input noticing activities that make this effective. So what I would do in my classes with this text is a stage before they move on to the productive stages where they're noticing this language and they're reusing this language. And here's an example of a text on a similar theme which reuses all of that language from the previous article, but it's not Herne Bay, Kent, it's not Rio, it's not tag, it's not dock, it's those phrases which are really reusable in other contexts. So they'll have to change them grammatically to fit the syntax of the new sentence, but they're going to adopt and use those new phrases, those new expressions in a fixed way. And then in a more productive phase, we ask them to use those personalized. So they talk about when they gave up hope of doing something, when they found their way from somewhere without a mobile phone, what does them good that they do on a daily basis. We make them adopt and take those phrases personally. And then we can walk away from the integrated skills lesson feeling there's been a rewarding teaching phase there, as well as that great setting up of activities, the monitoring, the feedback of their performance. We're really focusing in on the underlying competencies which support their integration of the skills, which support them taking content from a receptive text and moving that into a productive text. So I think there's a real responsibility with integrated teaching activities not to miss this phase of actual teaching, just to be content with setting up integrated skills practice activities. Let's move on to testing, because in practice, can we honestly say that independent skills tests exist? I mean, over 100 years ago, the Cambridge English Proficiency Test had a writing paper, still has today, as I'm sure many of you will know, still has a writing paper. But the writing paper of 100 years ago, look at this writing paper. Write an essay on one of the following subjects. I don't know which one you'd choose, but I'd be fairly stuck to do this in my English exam writing paper. The point being, of course, that it's pretty impossible to do any of these essay writing tasks without quite significant, probably reading in advance, possibly listening in advance, but even at the earliest single independent writing task stage of test construction, we're talking about integrating of reading and your knowledge from reading into your writing, even though it's claimed to be a writing paper. We might be able to argue, I suppose, that a traditional multiple choice reading test, when you have a reading paper and you have to read the questions and you have to read the options, is about as purely independent as we can get for a single skill. It's an argument that we have, but it's such an extreme end of the spectrum that's hard to apply it to other skills independently. Perhaps for a listening test, we have this kind of really as much independence as we can possibly get. So we have a listening text, minimal prompts for the questions, and we have visual options rather than written options, so we can try and isolate that listening skill as much as possible. So I guess it's possible to argue that you can really make skills independent in test settings, but it's a very thin end of the spectrum, and really the reality, I think, rather than the principle, is that all test tasks sit somewhere on this spectrum, from wholly independent, okay, possibly that traditional reading paper with reading texts and reading questions and multiple choice reading answers, through to wholly integrated, which we'll come on to. And I think most test tasks you'll find will sit somewhere on that continuum, either more independent because they've reduced the input on the productive test, or more independent because they've tried to minimize contamination from any other skill in the receptive tests. But actually, for me, more interesting is this right-hand end of the spectrum, where we move towards more conscious and more deliberate integration of the skills. The interesting part sits up there, is where we see, let's skip through to this one. This is an example from a English online academic English test, which is explicitly combining the skills, and you can possibly, hopefully, read the instructions to the candidate, the rubric in British English, hear a lecture, so listening, write a summary for a fellow student, so listening into writing, explicitly integrating those two skills, and the scores contribute both to the listening score and the writing score, because they still have a desire to report those skills separately rather than as an integrated task. But the task itself is fully integrated. It's listening into writing delivered online. Another example in the integrated skills for English, independent listening task, although it's called independent, if you look at the prompts there, you listen to a recording, then you tell the examiner what the talk's about. So listening into speaking. You listen again and take some notes if you want to, listening into writing, and then respond to the examiner's instructions. So listening into speaking. So we've got these stages of a test task, a formal exam task, which are given to explicit integration of tasks. Interestingly, they step back from that in the same way that the previous one reports the scores independently. They step back as well, and they say the examiner awards a score on how well you've understood the recording, your speaking and writing are not assessed. though it's difficult to really understand how your speaking and writing are not assessed if that's the only way they can see how well you've understood the recording. So that becomes a bit circular in its definitions. Here's another international exam task from a hugely popular international exam. Explicit that the test structure is to see a 230 to 300 word reading passage, very short time to read, a 2-minute lecture on a same topic from a different perspective, so listening and reading integrated in the input, another chance to read, and then 20 minutes to write your output. And that could be a spoken output or it could be a written output. So integrated not only on the receptive side, but integrated then into the reading and listening, into the speaking, or into the writing. So we've got examples from major test publishers of integrated skills that are more towards this right-hand end of the client, that actually really explicitly focus on integrating those skills in the test tasks, and are starting to get there in integrating the way the scores are reported and what that means in terms of students' proficiency with language. Here's another one from a business English test, which I came across recently. A customer services manager, so we're setting the context, we're setting the purpose, we're setting the audience, read the email thread, listen to an answer phone message, write a formal response. So reading followed by listening on the same topic, then writing as the output. So the explicit integration there, the interesting part of this client for me, right at the top, right at the right-hand end there. So I think we've got some implications for testing here. And the implications for me are about being honest about what we think the test task, the assessment is doing. And I think that's about the construct being our beliefs about how language is operationalized, our beliefs about what big means, to take you back to our 4 trees. Our construct is what we mean by big, what we mean by good performance. So how each of those integrated language skills are operationalized, so how they are used in the test task, how important they are, how important your receptive skills are, how important your productive skills are in terms of weighting, and how they're measured, how you're going to actually recognize those different components of the skills being integrated. And that can be, for me, an acknowledgement that this is a listening into writing task. It's not a listening task followed by a writing task. The entire task is an integration of listening and writing. And so I'm reporting a score about the student's ability to listen and write as part of the same score. It may mean that our score sheets are a bit more complicated, that we have a listening score and we have a listening into writing score and we have a listening into speaking score. But I think that just adds to the richness of the reporting we're giving, particularly in diagnostic senses, and I would say in proficiency senses as well. And beyond the construct, the reality has to provide tasks which are authentic in the integration of language, which actually do reflect real world integration. So that's probably going to be receptive into productive. It's possible, I guess, that you could give someone a creative writing task with a picture to write about, and then read somebody else's writing task on the same picture, and you could write into reading. But it seems much more logical and real world to me to be talking about reading and listening into speaking and writing. And certainly for those of you working in academic English contexts, professional English contexts, we can think of a huge range of authentic operations of language which are wholly integrated at their source, that we can't make independent with any value for what happens in the real educational world, or the real world of English for business or English for work. And those marking schemes need to reflect and acknowledge that construct. So for example, rather than having task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy in our writing paper, why not have a category that's about information transfer, that looks at the success of understanding of the information from the input texts as part of the response, as part of the written text or as part of the spoken response? Why not be explicit in our marking criteria about where that content has come from and how important the comprehension of that content is to the effective production of the output? I think we need to be explicit about this, or we're not going to move into the areas we need to move, and we're just going to keep integration as kind of a hidden dirty secret that happens behind the scenes, but actually we're still in thrall to this idea of let's report a listening score, let's report a writing score, and never the twain shall meet. So where are we going to go from here? If you accept my arguments, if you accept some of my arguments about integration in teaching and the role of the teacher, some of my arguments about integration in testing and the importance of honesty and explicitness and transparency about what we're measuring, when and how do we move forward? Where's our empirical basis for this? Where's our support? Where's our frameworks of reference? Otherwise, it becomes everybody's measuring something different. Everybody's perception of what an integrated skill looks like and feels like and is scored is like the Indian folk tale of the blind men and describing an elephant, and everybody's perception of what performance is like is different. We need something to hold us together in terms of what this language looks like in practice and what it looks like in terms of scales and measurement and expectations of learners at different levels of proficiency. And I think this comes from the companion volume's focus on mediation in the Common European Framework of Reference, an explicit desire in that Common European Framework of Reference companion volume to move away from a traditional paradigm of reception and production and the four skills model through interaction and recognizing that in interactive settings, communicative language teaching, we do want to see these skills in interaction together, on to mediation, which really talks about action-oriented, real-world, authentic use of language, acknowledging those skills are used in combination together, and acknowledging, crucially, that when we are involved in language use, very often we're mediating other people's texts, we're mediating other people's messages, whether that's a newspaper article or what your friend has told you, we're still not creating every bit of language that we use in language learning and language assessment. In mediation, you're less concerned with just expressing your own needs and ideas and expression than you are with those other texts, those other people, that communication, that making of meaning that you are involved in a language activity to do. So we have to drill down a little bit deeper to look at what the mediation scales really describe, to see how useful they are for all aspects of integrating the skills. And this means that we acknowledge what's written in the Common European Framework, that it's separated out into three categories, that we have mediating a text, which is really working with other people's texts and helping people who couldn't otherwise understand those texts, whether they're written or spoken, helping those people access the concepts, the meaning in those texts. The mediating of concepts, other ways of facilitating access to those concepts. Maybe they don't understand what's being talked about or what's being written about because of their own cultural expectations, because of their age limitations, because of their cognitive limitations, because of their linguistic limitations. So how can we put that into manageable accessibility for the people we're working with? And then the third category of mediating communication. So what happens when communication breaks down? How can we intervene to make sure that communication between two other parties, whether that's two people or two groups or a text and a reader or a text and a listener, how can we support that as the person with the language skills to build the bridge? And all of these categories are related in the CEFR in terms of the descriptive scales we're familiar with from the traditional pre-A1, A1, A2, up to C1 and C2. And so there are now in the companion volume descriptive scales talking about mediation across these categories in very many specific action-oriented scales, with descriptors of what we might expect and what we might see as typical performance at different levels, the ones we're familiar with if we use the CEFR. And so all of those boxes with the less bold writing mean there's a scale describing this. And that's really important for us because so many of these, as you'll see later, are born integrated. They're all about using integrated skills in action rather than using skills in isolation. In fact, we'd probably go so far to say they're all dependent on having an integrated approach to teaching and learning and assessment. To be able to manage mediation, you need to be in that space. Interestingly, and I think worth highlighting here, is that Brian North, one of the key intellects and authors behind the CEFR, said recently that all those descriptors in the new companion volume seem appropriate for learner-led goal setting, learner-led assessment of what they can do in particular situations. Not all of them, but some of them might be useful for classroom-based assessment, for teacher-led assessment, for actually being able to be formative with your assessment and to be objective or subjectively giving qualitative responses to what students do. And there are some which might be examinable, which might be testable, which might be able to put into formal situations, perhaps those ones which are familiar, interpreting a graph in writing, these kind of things that, or being solving a problem in a group. Some of these might be suitable for exam situations. It doesn't mean that every mediation scale has to be able to turn into a test task. Some of them are appropriate for learner-led activities, some of them may be appropriate for teacher-led activities, and some of them may be appropriate for test and exams. But we need to keep this in mind and not think that every scale means it must be a test task. So why is mediation important and why is it relevant to real life skills? Well, always in real life, we find ourselves in between people or texts and people who couldn't understand each other without our support. Maybe that's because A and C speak different languages. Maybe they come with different registers of the same language. Maybe their language levels are too different. Maybe they have expertise in one part of a subject, but it's not suitable for someone who doesn't have that expertise. Maybe that's because the text themselves or the language someone is using is so rich in terminology or jargon that it's difficult for someone to understand without help. Maybe it's because their learning needs are different and they're processing text at different paces or for different purposes. Maybe there's a cultural bridge that needs to be built there because the concepts that are being talked about, the reference points in the text are not accessible to someone who hasn't experience of that culture. Maybe it's an age gap. Maybe it's something that's really familiar to those who might be of a Generation Z who know how social media works, and they're trying to explain something to someone who is a more what's the word I'm looking for? Non-digital. I can't. The word has gone. You know what I mean? Analog. A more analog processor of the world. Maybe it's because there's an opinion gap there, and that needs bridging. So that actually the communication needs to be built. So I'd argue that these are all real world cases that we can see in many contexts. And because I'm talking to you as teachers, I want to ask you whether this is true. So I'm going to show you some typical, or I think typical teacher activities that you might have seen in the classroom. You might have done them yourselves, you might have seen them as an observer, you might have experienced them as a learner perhaps. Just have a look through and see how many of these you've done or you've seen or you've been exposed to. Okay, do these look like familiar things? Taking a text, summarizing it, exemplifying it, highlighting, drawing attention to features, resolving an argument between two students who have a difference of opinion, activating schemata like I did with the pigeon pictures, discussing grammatical choices and whether there's a right way or an implication of a particular choice, using timelines and talking about how the timeline represents time and tense, reporting on your students, writing formal or informal reports on their progress, setting up debates, doing feedback, in giving learners the space to talk about their own contexts and their own cultures, reading for yourself to learn as a teacher about a particular grammar area and then explaining that in your own words to the students. I think you'll be with me saying these are fairly common and familiar teacher activities. I'm not suggesting that anything here is particularly controversial in terms of a teacher's practice. If we actually take those examples of teacher practice and look at them in what we're actually doing there, here's the first one, taking an authentic text. Well, actually, we're amplifying a dense text. We're taking a difficult text and we're making it more accessible by adding to it. When we're resolving an argument, we're facilitating communication and trying to avoid conflict between students and trying to resolve this difference of opinion. When we're doing a leading activity, activating schemata, we're linking to previous knowledge we hope students will have. When we're inviting students to discuss grammatical options, we're encouraging them to talk about grammar as a concept and to talk about language conceptually. When we're drawing a timeline and explaining that to the students, we're explaining the data, the times, the lines, the points on it in speech. When we're writing a report on students, we're taking all our input from listening to them and working with them, and we're relaying that in writing. When we're setting up a debate and conducting feedback, we're leading group work. When we're inviting learners to talk about their own context and their own cultures, we're facilitating pluricultural space. And when we read about something that's perhaps too dense or too conceptual for the students, and we're putting that in our own language to explain it to them, we're adapting that language for them. So all of these things that teachers do are part of the scales of mediation in the new companion volume of the CEFR. So all of those things that teachers do as part of their everyday practice prove that teachers are great mediators, that we have those mediation skills in abundance. Or to make it another way, it's very difficult to be an effective teacher without being a good mediator. So the question for us is, how do we transfer this knowledge to our students who perhaps aren't so lucky as to go into teaching as their professional choices? How do we use these scales to formalize and to structure the way we talk about language? Well, as I said, all of these scales have descriptors. All of these boxes are built for us to explore, to exploit, to reference, to build on, to make relevant. If we just take one, here's a couple of extracts from the B2 descriptors. Two of the scales from the mediation section of the Common European Framework, encouraging conceptual talk. So we've got loads of examples there of what our expectations might be at a particular level, what our tasks might be, what our assessment options might be that come out of these. And then if we're using these as our building blocks, we're relating in an a priori sense to the way language is defined and described in the Common European Framework, and looking at these mediation descriptors, then we're already taking a huge step towards that alignment, because we're building our tasks and we're building our expectations and we're building our evaluations of successful performance on the way these things are described in the Common European Framework. Of course, we have to do this in a structured way, and we have to do this in a way that requires work. We need to make it relevant to our own tasks and to our own context and our own language use environments and to what the students' needs are and what the students' ages are. But there's so much support with those mediation descriptors that will help us design and align and refer to mediation as part of integrated skills and be part of bringing integration through into that mediated skills approach to both teaching and assessment. But we need a way of accessing those scales, and the CEFR is quite a hefty tome, not great bedtime reading unless you're really trying to get to sleep, to plow through all the scales in the companion volume or the original book. So I just want to introduce you to one tool which I hope will be useful for you there, and it's called the CEFR filtering tool, which we've worked on at NILE. We have an area that's completely free called NILE membership on our website, and if you click on NILE membership on the website, you can register for an account. Once you've registered, you can sign in and you'll become a member of the NILE members area. When you go to the members area, you'll see loads of resources, all of which are free, video resources, teacher training ideas, teaching ideas, but there's one particular block of content which is called the NILE CEFR filtering tool. And if you click on that, you'll be able to download this tool that we've developed. And this tool is an Excel spreadsheet, nothing more fancy than that, but it's an Excel spreadsheet which contains all of the descriptors from the companion volume in the CEFR in one space. And the great thing about it is that it's got filters across the top. So you can say, I'm only interested in mediation. So you can click the drop-down menu for skill focus and just select mediation, not speaking, listening, reading, or writing. And then you can say, I'm only interested in B1 mediation descriptors. So you can go straight to level B1 in the filter on that column. And then you get access to all of the descriptors covering all of the scales related to mediation at one particular level. So it makes it much easier to think as a broad overview. Am I covering the right topics? Am I setting the right expectations? Am I including all the scales which might be relevant? But then also to take them out, to copy and paste them into those documents you're creating for your own syllabuses and your own tests and your own teaching tasks and your own learning outcomes for your students. So it's a really useful tool to get to grips with all the wealth of descriptors that there are across the CEFR, and particularly, well, in my context and my argument today for mediation being the key resource for working with integrated skills, but in your context, you may have more specific needs or focus areas that you could use this tool for. So that's completely free if you come to the NILE members area. And really, those are the arguments I wanted to make to you today as part of this presentation. The idea that integration of skills is thoroughly and very rigorously underpinned by the CEFR's approach to mediation. That in a teaching context, we have a responsibility to think about how are we going to improve the skills of learners to move between the receptive skills and the productive skills by active engagement with noticing and input activities during opportunities for practicing skills in integration. And an assessment space, how we have to be brave to be explicit about the way we're measuring integrated skills and acknowledge that in our marking criteria when we set up integrated tasks, and perhaps be brave enough to say that this is not just measuring listening or writing, it's measuring a mediation skill, which is listening into writing, or it's reading into speaking. And because we've got that support from the CEFR, which describes action-oriented real-world activities that involve more than one skill, I think this is the way to support our activity doing that. As someone said recently, the Stone Age didn't end because people ran out of stones. It's up to us as teachers to drive this approach and to investigate and experiment with integrated approaches to teaching and assessment, because it won't necessarily change around us. The paradigm of looking at skills independently in teaching materials and testing materials has been around for over 100 years now, and it's time for us to push that and to expand those barriers into an integrated approach to teaching and assessment, in my opinion. So thanks very much for listening. I'm going to turn off the slides now, but not before I've given you a chance to take my email address and to take the website address if you want to join the NILE members area and access not just that CEFR filtering tool, but all the other resources that are free from us at NILE. Thank you very much for listening and for interacting and contributing in different parts of this session. I hope it's been useful to you, and I hope that there are some comments and questions coming through in the chat box that we can spend a few minutes discussing now.
Thank you, Tom, so much. It was really beneficial. Thank you. So guys, if you have any questions, please drop them in your chat box.
Okay, I'll address Andrew's question. I think it's a brilliant point he's made there earlier in the session. I'm just scrolling back up to through the chat to do this. So Andrew is saying, I think the main downsides of integrated tests is they make banking and item regeneration nearly impossible. Let's deal with that one first. So yes, in a sense, but it depends whether we're banking based on item difficulty and item differentiation, item discrimination, rather than on task creation. I think there is an approach that some places, some institutions are taking. I'm not sure about test publishers, where they're separating things out into two halves, really. So they're doing a more discrete point-based construction of a part of the test for the receptive skills, but then them using the same text as part of an integrated activity. So they're trying to get more bang for their buck, as Dave's expression. They're trying to use the same text for two purposes. First, a kind of discrete point item specific comprehension task, and then an integrated task, which seems to me a useful and sensible approach. I think that the kind of tasks which are based, so the kind of output tasks which are based on input texts and working actively and transferring information from input texts, can be regenerated in terms of task banking. I think it introduces an interesting element which we didn't have time for here, but the element to which an integrated task could actually depend on a text chosen by the learner rather than by the test designer, or selected from a choice prepared by the test designer rather than a single text leading into a single task. I think we have tools enough nowadays to do some fairly detailed objective analysis of fairly detailed objective analysis of text difficulty, which allows us to draw equivalents on a number of variables between texts, certainly in terms of word, of sentence length, of type token ratio, of lexical difficulty as determined by some of the CEFR tools, that we could argue that texts are fairly similar in their linguistic and syntactic content, if not in obviously rhetorical organization or topic. So we might be able to have text which use banks of texts, and then actually the task approach is replicable across different contexts. So yes, absolutely point taken and very perceptive, but I think we have to think about the way we're talking about item banking and reuse of items and tasks in a different way. Okay, the other one is really about test purpose, isn't it? Do these integrated tests accurately identify the learner's challenges and strengths? So in other words, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, can integrated tests be used for diagnostic purposes? And again, I think it's about our construct, isn't it? They can be used for diagnostic purposes if we're interested in a construct which is explicitly integrated. So they can be used for, can this person listening into writing, can they be used to determine where the weaknesses or the strengths are in the listening process and in the writing process? I would argue yes, if our criteria for what we're looking at are explicit enough. For example, the contribution of information and content transfer being a receptive skill, whereas the contribution of perhaps organization and coherence and cohesion being a productive side of that. Can we use the same test task to do that diagnostically? Yes, but obviously not in the traditional way of, and of course there is huge value in diagnostic approaches to looking at individual skills, particularly for listening and reading. If we think about what strength in listening is composed of at the phoneme level, at the phrase level, at the grammatical level, and then onto the whole text level. I'm drawing on John Field's framework of listening proficiency here. But yes, of course, some of those isolating difficulties at the phoneme level are not going to be measurable or visible at the integrated production task level, unless we see something really explicit where a key piece of content has been misheard because of a misheard phoneme, but that's probably not the level of diagnosis we want to be going into. So yes, of course they have their place in diagnostic assessment, but can we do a diagnostic job at a broader level with integrated tasks? I think yes. Sorry, I knew that was almost another presentation response to your question, but a great question. I noticed something from Linda earlier. It was about the sequence of activities in the mini pigeon learning sequence we had. I can't remember where I was, but essentially I was arguing that after processing a text for its inherent value and its meaning, and then its comprehension in maybe a more structured way, then we draw students' attention to some of the features of the text which are reusable and which are valuable for their future use of language, and then we do them then we take them out of the source text, and then we put them into a more controlled environment, which was my gap text, and then we personalize them for learners. When they've seen them in a more controlled way, we personalize them so they become kind of part of their active personalized repertoire. Of course, there's other lesson sequences are available. You could say that after the receptive task, the most effective way to create students to notice the difference is to ask them to reproduce the text in written form themselves, and then to notice the difference between the use of these phrases in the original text and the text they've produced as part of your noticing activity. That would be a very valid and valuable approach to noticing with students. So I think there's different ways you could sequence that learning activity, but I think it's the explicit focus on reusable texts for mining for their value in other contexts. That's the piece of the learning sequence which often gets forgotten when we're giving opportunities to practice integrated skills. Noha says, if I was to use one word to describe mediation, what would that word be? Oh God, what a great question, Noha. I mean, I would love to have a single word. I'm going to use two, and then they're not mine. They're borrowed from somebody else who's worked a lot with the CEFR, which is Enrico Picardi, and it's a presentation I saw from her, and she said mediation is about making meaning. And so making meaning is that idea of we're not creating new language every time we work with language. We're very often making meaning for others. We're setting up situations, and we're using our skills and our knowledge to make meaning accessible. So mediation is about making meaning for others through the way we use our language.
Can I say something?
Yes, no.
Can it be facilitating?
Yeah, I think facilitating for me has a more passive sense, and that we're trying to get people, my example there where I had A and C, and we have to fulfill the role of B in between them, maybe to build all these bridges for things they don't have. Facilitating for me perhaps suggests that we want to encourage A and C to get together and to be able to do it for themselves, which could be an end goal. But I think in mediation, we have a little bit more of an active role to actually build those bridges and be that linguistic, cultural expectation bridge between them. But absolutely, facilitation is a key part of doing that. And that's perhaps the end goal of working with mediation, is that you can facilitate, you can set people up to continue independently once they've had the support from you as the mediator.
Thank you.
Paolo's asking about the noticing activity. Are we sure that students are interested in reusing these collocations in their free writing? Well, are we sure that learners want to use all the language that teachers select for them to encounter? Are we sure that they need to read all the texts that are in the course books that are prepared for them? Absolutely no. It would be ideal. And what I do with this kind of activity is, in a subsequent lesson, or part of the same lesson, or part of the same sequence of lessons, I bring in different texts and I ask them to choose their own text and to mine the text for phrases that they think they can use. It's leading them to water rather than making them necessarily drink, Paolo. But I guess my argument is more that I think those phrases are more valuable than dock and tag and Herne Bay. Thank you for the question. Yeah, Dave's point. The test of interactional English or test of international English in Ireland allows learners to select and talk about their own text, follow a news story for a number of weeks, read a piece of extended reading that they use as the basis for their production. It's a really interesting longitudinal almost approach to integrating skills. Oh, Andrew, good question. Should adaptive tests adapt questions in reading, for example, based on the testee's response in a different skill? Okay, so Andrew's asking about adaptive tests, which are those tests where every learner's next question in the test is based on their success on the previous question. So on the first question, you get an answer right or wrong, or perform to a particular level of ability, and the next question you face will be different to someone who scored differently on their first question. So the question there is, if we're integrating skills in adaptive tests, is it fair that the jump in difficulty, either up or down in difficulty, is based on integration of skills? I think possibly not. I think perhaps the adaptive part of the test needs to be based on the as independent a measure as possible as you can get. Obviously easier with reading on screen and reading text on screen than necessarily listening and then having to read your options for the response, or perhaps on the underlying competencies, the kind of English in use, integration of vocabulary and grammar. Perhaps that should be the first stage of the adaptive jumps, but then at the output stage, I think that the text that's appropriate for your level of difficulty, which has been determined by the adaptive steps, could lead into a productive task. Two birds with one stone in principle. Maybe I'm oversimplifying the problem here, but yeah, very interesting question again, Andrew.
I don't think we have any more questions.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was really fruitful. Thank you so much. And I want just to share that the certificate will be sent to you as well as the attendees. Thank you so much for all the attendees for sharing their questions. Thank you so much, Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, so please let us know when the recording is available. Thank you everyone for giving your time and attention today. I hope it was useful. I really hope some of you go in and download that CEFR filtering tool. It's useful for your work. And of course, major thanks to the Teacher Training Centre at Faros University of Alexandria for the invitation.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye everyone. Enjoy your day.
Bye.